Y'all ready? What's the first section?
Starts with a P.
22.
You got it. I guess that's pretty close. All right.
Genesis, Exodus,
Leviticus,
Numbers.
Deuteronomy. Are we gonna just skip like
All
that?
right. That's the first section. What's the next one?
History.
All right.
Joshua,
Judges,
Ruth,
Ruth, 1 Samuel,
2 Samuel,
1 Kings,
2 Kings, 1 Chronicles, 2 Chronicles. Esther,
Nehemiah,
Job,
Esther,
All right. What's the next section?
Wisdom,
now it's Job,
well, Psalm,
Proverbs, Ecclesiastes.
Yes, the one you always get stuck on.
Yeah, Book of Solomon, or Song of Solomon. I was
That's
gonna
it.
call it a book.
Yeah. All right. Next section.
Major prophets.
All right. What's the
Isaiah,
All right.
Jeremiah,
Lamentations,
Ezekiel,
Daniel,
All right. What section are we in now?
Minor
Minor.
Prophets. Okay, I'll just sit back. This is yours.
all right.
What's
It
the
normally
first?
starts with Hosea.
Okay. All right.
And I missed
Joel.
Joel, and then Amos, I think, is next. That's the
Yeah.
last one I've been to.
Okay.
I'm,
Oh,
yeah,
The one with the whale.
Jonah,
Job,
Yeah.
Michael,
All right. What did we do last week?
NAB,
Nahum. Yeah, you gave me this.
Nahum.
Nahum,
Nahum.
And the one that we like to pronounce. What are we doing today? I told y'all to practice.
Habakkuk.
Habakkuk,
Habakkuk. Habakkuk.
Habakkuk.
Sounds like you should be in Star Wars.
Yeah. That's a cousin. That's a
Oh,
cousin
it
of
is,
Chewbacca.
okay.
Yeah. Habakkuk. Yeah.
Oh,
Habakkuk. Okay. So today we are in, well, I better start this that way I can record this spread. Today we are in the book of Habakkuk. Habakkuk is the author. There's not a lot of contention about that. I think primarily it's because we know next to nothing about Habakkuk. He's like a couple of the other minor prophets where there's really nothing told. We don't really know anything about where he's from, but we do know that he was a prophet. That's about it. He's somebody that could have been known in his day. Maybe that's why there was no introduction. He would be what you call a contemporary of the prophet Jeremiah, and perhaps maybe he may have been around with Daniel. Whether he knew Daniel or not, we don't know that. But he could have been, very well could have been around the time of Jeremiah and may have known Jeremiah, may have been familiar with his prophecies. There's some things in this book that are similar to, or seem like they have been taken maybe from the book of Isaiah. Now Isaiah came before Habakkuk did. Isaiah came in the 700 BCs. Habakkuk would have come in the 600 BCs before the downfall of Judah, or during the downfall of Judah. So there is a time frame here. As far as the date that this was written, most people think that it was written somewhere between the 640s and the early 600s. maybe even later than that, maybe in the 500s, where he actually saw the downfall of Judah. So you've got several decades there where this could have been written. As far as the historical context of this, we don't know where Habakkuk was from. We think that he may have been writing from Judah, simply because by the time he was writing this, the Assyrians had already conquered the northern kingdom of Israel. So more than likely, he was writing from the southern kingdom of Judah. More than likely, he would have been familiar with the things that were going on. Now, during that time, a lot of people think that he started writing these little collections for this small book around the time after Josiah. You're familiar with Josiah. He was the young child that took over when he became king when he was 8 years old, and there was a great reform. Now remember in the movie Jeremiah that we watched, when they were digging and doing some work in the temple, and they actually found the law. And remember, it was Josiah who reinstituted the bringing back and making sure that people were doing what they were supposed to according to the law. And so there was a short reform for Israel, or for Judah at this time. And so this was a good thing for Judah. But Assyria was in control. Assyria had been a powerhouse, but their power, they started weakening. And we talked about that some last week, but they started weakening. And Josiah had went out, and he was trying to fend off the Egyptians from heading northward to fight in this battle. And Josiah himself was fatally hit, and he died, fairly young in his age. And so the successor, once Josiah died, the next successor did not do so well. And Judah, when this was written, Judah had fallen deep into idolatry once again. And so that's kind of where this takes place. It comes from a time where reform was remembered, but then it was falling into deep despair, deep idolatry, deep sinfulness. And this was all happening around the time that Assyria was losing power, but Babylon was gaining power and would eventually take over Assyria, capture Assyria, and then go on and extend their borders down through Judah, take over Egypt, take over pretty much, they would be the world superpower. So that's the historical context in which this book is written. As far as getting into the book, now remember, as we've said, a lot of times it's not the length of the book that doesn't mean or makes it mean that it doesn't have an impact. What I found that these little books are just as impactful. Some of them may be more so because they put so much in just a short amount of time that they really get their point across. And this is one of those books, when you really look at it, you understand the historical context of what's going on. It really is a very powerful little book that's only 3 chapters long, and the chapters really aren't that long. So we'll go ahead and get into this. And Habakkuk chapter 1 states that the oracle that Habakkuk the prophet saw. And so that's all we know about Habakkuk. We know he was a prophet and know that he saw a vision. That's it. That's all we know about him. We don't know anything beyond that. And so, anything else that we go beyond this is kind of conjecture. But it's interesting how this letter or this book is composed. Because the very first thing that we see from Habakkuk is a complaint. And so we're not that different after all, are we? See, complaining has been around for a long time. And we still do it. But what you see in the first couple chapters is you see Habakkuk voice a complaint, and then you see God's answer. And so we go through two stages of this. In the first one here, we look at Habakkuk's complaint, and we're going to read through this. Verse 2, O Lord, how long shall I cry for help, and you will not hear? Or cry to you violence, and you will not save? Why do you make me see iniquity, and why do you idly look at wrong? Destruction and violence are before me, strife and contention arise. So the law is paralyzed, and justice never goes forth. For the wicked surrounded the righteous, so justice goes forth perverted. Now this type of writing is not that unusual, because if you read the Psalms, remember when we went through it, the Psalms has a section of Psalms that are called Impricatory Psalms, where they kind of do this. They cry out for justice, ask the Lord why the wicked are prospering, and if He's ever going to do anything about it, and then they ask the Lord for justice. So it's not uncommon to ask questions like this. Don't we ask questions like this today?
Yes.
We were just talking about it before we started. So that in itself is not uncommon. Righteous people, when people come to the realization this relationship that they have with God, and they see the world around them through that lens, you ask the question, how long is this going to keep going? How long will the evil keep going, and how long will God sit by and let it happen? Those are questions that we can't answer. Those are things that are often done in God's time. And sometimes those are things that, as we've seen with, like with the book of Jonah and with Nineveh. God said that they were going to be destroyed. He gave that message to Jonah to take to Nineveh, said God is going to judge you, and they immediately repented. And God relented of that, but He did not forget His announcement, because once they turned their back on Him and went back and continued their evil ways, God brought forth His judgment and His wrath upon Nineveh. But it took about 120 years. Most people don't live that long. So a lot of times, God says something is going to happen, and we'll talk about this, because that's something I want to talk about that Habakkuk talked about here, is waiting upon the Lord. And, sometimes you don't always see His answer, but He still asks you to trust Him anyway. Because our timing is not God's timing. God is outside of time. That's the thing that we can't comprehend. But He's outside of time, and things look so different from God's perspective. God sees things before we do. He knows how things are going to play out. And, we have to trust that, if as long as we are faithful to God, then we know that His sovereignty is going to play out, whether we're here to see it or not. And that's that is hard. Admittedly, that is hard to do. Because, especially now, we're a now generation. When we click on something, we got, our phones, or, calling people, or scrolling the internet, or whatever. We're a now people. We want things to happen now. We don't like waiting. And, even for the generation who grew up waiting, they've grown a little impatient over time. So, that's one of those things, but it is difficult to wait on the Lord. Especially when we see things going on that we just know are not right. And when it's something that we can do absolutely nothing about personally. It is hard. And so I totally feel for the prophet here. And I can see we can all step in his shoes, because we've all asked this question. How long are you going to let this go, Lord? Now, when we look at God's answer, that starts in verse 5. in verses 5 and 6 here, this is kind of where it gives the answer. He says, look among the nations and see. Wonder and be astounded. For I am doing a work in your days that you would not believe if told. For behold, I am raising up the Chaldeans, that bitter and hasty nation, who march through the breadth of the earth to seize dwellings not their own. Okay, so first of all, God says here, He says, look around and be amazed and astounded. Now, think about what's going on. There is turmoil all around. And God says, look around, wonder, and be astounded. And He continues, He says, for I am doing a work. Now, our natural thought process is when we look around and we see chaos all around, is our natural response, oh, well, I see God doing the work here. You know, when chaos is all around and it seems like the world is crumbling down, that's just a natural response. You know, we want to say, okay, God, everything is crumbling. Where are you at? But see, just like, you know, that was, you know, we have the human response just like Habakkuk. But God gives us the same answer that He gave Habakkuk. He says, look around, wonder and be astounded. You see everything's going on. Empires fighting, colliding with each other. Your own nation collapsing right before your eyes. And then He says, behold, I am doing a work. And see, you know, that's hard for us to understand. When things are not going good, it's hard for us to see how God is working. But that's where that patience and that faith comes into play, because God is always working. God is always working. He says, for I am doing a work in your day, and He said that you would not believe if told. Now, you think about some of the things that's worked out in your life. If God would have said, this is how this is going to play out, you would have said, I mean, I can use myself. The fact that I'm standing before you today, that was God doing the work, and if He would have told me, I would have said no. If anybody else would have told me, I would have said no, not in a million years. I would have not been a pastor. Absolutely no way, no how. But God was doing the work. I wouldn't have believed it if He told me. But yet here I am. And see, God was doing the work that I didn't know. And personally, a lot of things in my life were crumbling down. There was chaos all around my life. But yet, He was doing the work. I can look back and say that now. I think most people can. Most people who understand that God got a hold of them and changed their life, they can look back and say, oh yeah, I see it now. God was doing something. God's always working. God is always working. You know, I like how God can take these things. They're unbelievable to us. You know, if you go to the book of John tells us there towards the end, you know, that's the reason He wrote these things, is so that we would believe. Because we wouldn't believe them otherwise. And, you know, God tells him here, and He says, you know, I'm doing this work, and you wouldn't believe it if I told you. However, then He tells him another part of this, because this is the part that I guess he had a hard time believing. And I guess I would too. Any of us would. God said, for behold, I'm raising up the Chaldeans. So it is God saying, hey, I'm going to raise up this nasty nation, this one that's devouring everything in its path, You know, the Syrians were bad, but these people were even more powerful than the Assyrians. I'm going to use them. Now, you know, we're in the habit of arguing with God. We'd say, well, I don't think you're doing the right thing. Wouldn't you? If God said, I'm going to use that evil nation to work out my glory, we'd say, nah, that wouldn't be our choice. Don't we do that? So see, there again, God's ways are not our ways.
They're a lot better.
They are a lot better, aren't they?
They are.
You know, we read in Isaiah, you know, His understanding is not our understanding. His ways are not our ways. But we know that they work out when we trust Him.
And the way He works it out is just unbelievable.
It
can't
is.
be done in human ways.
It is. It's unbelievable. I know we could all sit here and share stories of how God has worked in our lives that just don't make sense.
Yes.
So you got valleys and mountains. Personally, I've learned more in the valleys than I have on the mountains.
We generally do.
Yeah.
And the thing that it should do is help us appreciate the mountaintops.
Well, it gives you more faith.
Yes.
Yeah.
We can't appreciate the good if we don't go through the bad.
Yep, that's right. And so basically, continue through this, the Lord's answer, He's basically telling him how bad the Chaldeans are, the Babylonians. The Chaldeans and the Babylonians are kind of interchangeable language because that's what the Babylonians were. There was like a smaller faction of Chaldean cities within the Babylonian Empire, and they just kind of consumed them. But it really is basically the same thing. So whenever you see Chaldean and Babylonian, it's talking about the same group of people. But He just tells them how nasty they are, tells them how bad they are, tells them how powerful they are. You know, gives some very apt descriptions there about how they'll go through and they'll sweep through the nation. But then we get to Habakkuk's second complaint. Go figure, he's got another one. This one starts in verse 12. He says, are you not from everlasting, O Lord, my God, my Holy One? We shall not die. O Lord, you have ordained them as a judgment, and you, O Rock, have established them for reproof. You who are of pure eyes than to see evil, and cannot look at wrong, why do you idly look at traitors and remain silent when the wicked swallows up the man more righteous than he? You make mankind like the fish of the sea, like crawling things that have no ruler. He brings all of them up with a hook. He drags them out with his net. He gathers them in his dragnet. So he rejoices and is glad. Therefore he sacrifices to his net and makes offering to his dragnet. For by them he lives in luxury and his food is rich. Is he then to keep on emptying his net and mercilessly killing nations forever? So he's talking about how great God is, how powerful, how omnipotent, omniscient that God is. He's all-knowing. So he's saying things to God that God obviously knows. But he asks him the question, he's like, how can you use a foreign nation? How can you use this nation to carry out your justice on people who are supposed to be more righteous than they? Well, when you look at the things that they were doing, were they really that righteous? They weren't. They were doing things just as evil as they were. You know, they were sacrificing their children to Molech. They were drunken orgies, sexual perversion, all the things that God had destroyed nations before them. When they came into the promised land, those were all the things that they were accused of, worshiping all these false gods. And God had took care of the nations as they were coming into the nation. And He strictly told them, He said, don't do these things, or this will happen. Well, they had a bad habit of not listening. Now, like we do today. Most people, and I've said this many occasions, when someone is sinning and doing things that you know are not right, you generally do not have to beat them over the head about it. Because they know. People know what is right and wrong. You will encounter very few people who do not know. Because you can see it in the way that they act and the way that they talk. They know when they're doing something wrong. Because I've had people ask me, so why didn't you say something to them about doing this, that, or the other? I said, why? They know what they're doing wrong. I said, do you think me illuminating it for them is going to make it any different? No. I can pray for them. And if they want my advice, I'll be more than happy to give it to them. But generally speaking, people know what is right and wrong. These people, they had the law. They knew what was right and wrong. They had prophets who were telling them what was right and wrong. They knew. They knew. They had no doubt what was right and wrong. And so He asked them, how can this happen? And he makes this statement. He talks about them mercilessly killing nations forever. That's what God had accused them of doing. They were killing their own people mercilessly. And we'll look at some things that God lists out here that Judah was doing and why they're going to be I should say the things that Babylon is doing, and he gives them an explanation about why these things are going to happen. But they were doing things just as bad. Now, if we look at chapter 2, verse 1, it goes with the end of chapter 1. Because if you look at his statement, it says, I will take my stand at my watchpost and station myself on the tower, and look out to see what he will say to me and what I will answer concerning my complaint. So basically, Habakkuk is saying, okay, I'll just sit back and watch and see what you do. So that was his first complaint, or his second complaint. And it was a rather lengthy one. But now God gives his second response. And that starts in verse 2. Chapter 2, verse 2. Said, and the Lord answered me. Now, I like this and understand this. He says, write the vision, make it plain on tablets, so he may run who reads it. That's a pretty dire warning. Have you ever read anything and said, you know what, maybe I should run? It's like when you get to the edge of a minefield. You should probably turn around and run the other way.
I don't know if you run.
Not through it, no. I'm talking about running away from it.
I don't know if you run anywhere where you just be real quick, careful where you step.
And God says, in verse 3, it says, for still the vision awaits its appointed time. It hastens to the end. It will not lie. If it seems slow, wait for it. It will surely come. It will not delay. So God is giving him an answer to his complaint. He said, just wait. It has not happened yet, but rest assured, it will. It will not lie. It will come to pass. You know, there's still a lot of promises left to be fulfilled in the Bible. And God is telling us the exact same thing. Because we have these same complaints, we ask, we plead with God, we cry out to Him, and He's telling us the same thing. He's saying, look, I've already promised them. It's going to happen. If it seems slow, wait for it. And then verse 4 really is kind of like I think the verse that kind of props this up. It says, behold, his soul is puffed up. It is not upright within him, but the righteous shall live by his faith.
That's a strong statement.
It is. It is a strong statement. Now, the thing about this, in understanding what he was saying here about the righteous shall live by faith, is you've got to understand the context in which God was answering him. Now, God had already told him that the things that He was telling him and showing him have yet to happen. That didn't mean that Habakkuk wouldn't stay alive long enough to see it, but God was telling him at that moment that they had not happened yet, but they were going to. He told him, just wait for it, be patient. And he reminds him that the righteous shall live by faith. Now what he's saying here is the same thing that he's saying to us today. There will be times in life where we may see some very horrible things, and we may ask the question of God, when are you going to take care of this? God's promise to us is that He doesn't forget these things. And He's saying that our faith allows us to be patient in His time in this temporal life, the life that we're living now. And to also, when we get to the other side, at that point, knowing of His faithfulness, knowing that He's not going to go back on His word or His promises, and that the evil, the unrighteous, will get theirs. They will meet His justice, whether we are here on this earth or whether we are in heaven with Him. That's what He's saying here, and that the righteous shall live by faith. Whether in life or death, that doesn't matter. God will carry out His promises. That is why we must remain faithful. I think that's something that we need to remember today. Because there are conflicts that we might see in this life that we may not see a resolution to while we're here. It may come to pass once we're gone. You know, if you think back, we were talking about the founding of this nation earlier. If you think back, there were a lot of people who envisioned what America would become. Those who fought with George Washington and many of the other freedom fighters. They did not get to see the writing of the Constitution. They didn't get to see the Bill of Rights. They didn't get to see these things take place. But they still went out and they fought for it, having faith that it would be completed, whether they were here or not. Now that's not an apt comparison to the Christian life, but yet it is somewhat of a comparison. You know, we all see things, and I think we all know people who are caught up in situations that we would love to see them get out of. You know, we pray for them, and maybe we see some hope in them or whatever. But we try to have faith that God is going to work things out. Because if you look at Habakkuk here and you look at the nation, what can Habakkuk do against a nation like this? Even knowing that God is the one who is rising up this nation. He tells him, he said, just be patient. Let my plan work out. And y'all pray for patience. They tell us not to.
Yeah, sometimes it's not good because you have to go through something to get patience. So sometimes it seems to create difficulties.
I think sometimes we try and we do a play on words. And we say, God, just give me the faith to get through this. And what we're really asking is, God, give me the patience. He knows what we mean. But he tells us to have faith. Just trust me, have faith. That's what he was saying to Habakkuk. That's what he's saying to us today as Christians. Have faith. Now, listen. There's a lot of bad things that are going to happen. He even tells us that there's some really, really bad things that are going to happen even before he comes back. He talks about how bad things are going to become. And then things are going to get even worse. But he tells us to have faith. So we know that, there is a chance that we could see some really, really tough times. But he tells us to have faith nonetheless. And that's what we must do. Now, here, as he's telling him to live by faith, and this idea that the righteous and the unrighteous alike will get their just rewards later on. That these things are not out of God's sight. He has not forgotten, nor he will forget. He knows who deserves what, and they will get that in the end. And so here, in part of this explanation, this answer that God gives to Habakkuk, there are 5 woes that are listed. And these are directed at the Babylonians. God's raising them up to do a powerful deed on his behalf. But this is why he's telling him to be patient. So the first one is in verses 6 through 8 of chapter 2. And this one deals with extortion and stealing. And then he's talking about how the Babylonians have made a craft out of extorting other nations. Because Babylon was so powerful, they would go in and do this type of criminality. But then they would also they would steal things that were not theirs. They would take things that were not theirs, and that was kind of how it was being a superpower. And I want to interject something right here, because there's a lot of people who talk about the evils of the United States. The United States of America is the most powerful nation that has ever existed. But yet they have taken less than any powerful nation in existence. A good example, just look at Canada and Mexico. Couldn't we just take them right now?
Right.
We could, but we don't. That was not the goal. The founders had looked at previous history, nations, looked at other documents that people had written, contracts that had been written, and they took all that into account. And so all these nations that have came before have taken. That's what they did. They just took. I'm sorry.
England was guilty of that.
Yeah.
They had, the sun never set on English power.
Yes. Yeah, and look at what the British were trying to do to America, or the beginnings of America.
England was one greatest Bible build in the world.
Well, it moves that way, but it was,
Well,
I wouldn't say as far as,
a lot of, most of, a lot of, just about all of the United States religion come from England.
well, yeah, I would say that, that's true, in part. I know that when Christopher Columbus came, I know that he imparted some of that. You know, there's things that are not told, and we discussed that when we did the history and Christianity, when we went through that, about how Christopher Columbus and some of those imparted some Christianity, you know, here while they were here.
Well, we just had the 400 Thanksgiving, and there was a lot of history.
Yeah.
But
Well, you know, one of the things about it, one of the things, if you look at why many of the people came here to begin with, was for religious freedom. So there was a lot of Europe that was not religiously free. They were under the confines of the Roman Catholic Church and the Church of England. And so, you know, it wasn't until, you know, people started translating the Bible into their own languages and being able to get it in other people's hands, did you really start to see a real kind of revival, a real awakening, because people just kind of did whatever the church told them to.
yeah,
And so as far as being a truly Christianized church, I would say that Europe probably did a pretty bad job. But you had some bright spots that come out of it. You know, people like John Wesley, George Fox, William Wilberforce, people like that, you know, really made an impact for Christianity. Did I say Martin Luther? Martin Luther, you know, he was the one who led the Protestant Reformation. John Wycliffe before him. So, I mean, there's a lot of standout people who were in Europe at the time who did some great things and brought some of that to America. But I would, by and large, I don't think, from what I understand, I don't think most of Europe was ever really Christianized to the extent that we, or I should say saved, I guess. Because if you look at it, most of these people, they thought, you know, a lot of it was about works, or that's what they were being taught, it was about works. Most people didn't have their own Bible. In fact, nobody except the religious elite and the wealthy, they were the only ones who had Bibles.
well, they was probably the only ones that could read.
So there was a lot of illiteracy, you know, and so I mean, you know, it's, God worked in a lot of different people, and you know, thankfully He worked in the right people to help the founding of our nation too. So, but anyway, that was the first woe, extortion and stealing. The second one was verse 9 to 11, unjust gain. You know, that was similar. The third woe, in verses 12 through 14, talking about basically their existence was built on violence. And he made a few points here. We'll go through this from verses 12 through 14. He says, woe to him who builds a town with blood and founds a city on iniquity. Behold, Is it not from the Lord of hosts that peoples labor merely for fire, and nations weary themselves for nothing? For the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters covers the sea. So here, he talks to him about, or tells him that this nation, the one that he's griping about, that God is using, God is telling him that because of how they've built their own city, because of how they've built their own nation, that it's all in vain. That everything that they built will come down. And he says here, he says, behold, is it not from the Lord of hosts? So he's saying that not only have they sinned against other people, but they had sinned against the Lord thy God. He said, all of this stuff that they're doing, all of this gain, that it's all for naught, it's all in vain, because it will all come crumbling down. For the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. And if you look at it, look at how the knowledge of God has expanded across the nation. If you were, as we were talking about before, how God was working things out, you look at how Habakkuk may have been viewing this and saying, okay, the northern kingdom of Israel has been destroyed, they're in ruin. So what about the people? Well, they've been carted off here, there, and everywhere. What about Judah? Well, Judah's going to be ransacked and destroyed, and they're going to burn the temple down. Everything looks pretty hopeless. But if you fast forward and look ahead, whenever the Babylonians come and destroy it, they carry the people into captivity. Well, some of those people didn't come back once that 70 years was over. That God had ordained that they should stay in captivity. A lot of people stayed where they were at. Guess what they did where they were at? They built tabernacles, or what we would call synagogues. Synagogues were a place of gathering. Look at how the message of God spread to other parts of the world because they were carted off. Because of their sin, God allowed them to flourish in other parts of the world. It allowed it to spread. And then take account of that, the Persians, they came. And then the Greeks came. The Greek with all with their philosophy and the arts, everything there, the Greek culture. There we get the Greek language. That was the world language. Even while the Romans came, they used the Greek language because it was easier to learn. That was the common man's knowledge. But if you look at what the Romans did, you had all of these synagogues across the Middle East. You had them all over in the Middle East. You had them all down in northern Africa. And what did the Romans do? They built roads. And guess what those roads did? They took the gospel even farther than those synagogues. So, from Habakkuk's point of view, he couldn't see that. And that's why God said, trust me, I got it covered. And now we look at today, look at how far the gospel has traveled. The gospel has gone worldwide. There are very few places on this earth that the gospel has not been spoken. Even in, like people like Jungle Jin, going to these remote tribes on the Amazon and working with them. Look at the gospel has been spread. They're doing that, and Africa is flourishing, in all of these Christian tribes. There's Christianity flourishing all over the globe. So, what we see right now, God sees far beyond that. God wants people saved. He don't want to send people to hell. So He's allowing things to happen so that the gospel can spread. But He's telling us that those things one day will come to an end. The evils that we see, they will come to an end. And we're thankful for that. We may not be here to see it. But he tells us, trust me anyway. Verses 15 through 17, the fourth woe is that they have shameful behavior associated with drunkenness. Well, that is no different than today. Not only does it make people act shameful, a lot of times drunkenness can cause people to dance too. There's that old joke, about being able to make people dance. People who couldn't dance, get a few drinks in them and boy, it loosens them right up. At some point that becomes shameful behavior if you see people dance. But I think what they were talking about was a lot of their drunkenness, and also involved a lot of lewdness, a lot of sexual immorality, and those things carried over through other cultures as well. So that was not something new. And then the fifth woe was idolatry. And he asks an important question here in verses 18 through 19. He says, what profit is an idol when its maker has shaped it, a metal image, a teacher of lies? For its maker trusts in his own creation when he makes speechless idols. He's talking about, these things that mere men create, that are speechless, they're motionless. They can do nothing, but yet they pray to them. They overlay them with gold and silver and make them ornate, and that becomes their god. And if you look at how you look at all the different gods that were being created and prayed to, and God simply asked them the question, said, why would you create something? Why would you not, it's basically, why would you not pray to the God who is uncreated? Why would you not pray to the God who does speak? Why would you not pray to the God who does create? Why would you not pray to the God who created you? Why would you not pray to the God who created everything? It's pointless, and he's still on this, that this is the reason that these kingdoms, not only the Babylonian kingdom, but other nations, they will also fall victim because they all are doing this thing. They're doing these things, and they're all going to fall and crumble. Their wickedness is going to lead them to destruction. Now, as we get into chapter 3 is it takes a different turn. This is a prayer. And he says, O Lord, I have heard the report of you, and your work, O Lord, do I fear. In the midst of the years revive it. In the midst of the years make it known. In wrath remember mercy. So he's complained, God has answered, and now he's offering a prayer here, and he's asking God that in his wrath also to show mercy. Now remember, that's not uncommon as well, because pretty much every single prophet that we have studied thus far has said something very similar. God has explained to them what is going to happen, or showed them what's going to happen, and that's one of those characteristics I think that they got from God, is that they know that God is a God not only of vengeance, an avenger, a God who will bring his wrath, but he is also a generous God, a God who loves repentance from those who may have been evil. He likes to grant mercy. He likes to grant grace on those who would turn. And so these prophets know that. And I think that's something we should remember sometimes. I think there have been times in our life where we've been too hard on ourselves because we think that God's not going to grant us mercy and forgiveness for things maybe that we've done. But we forget how big His mercy and grace really are. Verses 3 through 15, basically what Habakkuk is doing here is he's praising God's power. He's just using some very creative and some very powerful images to display God's power. And in verses 16 through 19, he talks about the sufficiency, talks about God's sufficiency. Or 17 through 19, I should say. It says, though the fig tree should not blossom, nor fruit be on the vines, the produce of the olive fail, and the fields yield no food, the flock be cut off from the fold, and there be no herd in the stalls. Yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will take joy in the God of my salvation. Now think about that. That is a powerful statement. That is a statement that is talking about the full sufficiency of God. Because if you look at what he just said, think about Israel. Think about the crops that they had. The fig tree should not blossom. Figs were a big produce.
Yeah.
All right? No fruit on the vines. So if you look at grapes, wine was a big produce. Israel, all up and down Israel, producing, vast amounts of fruit, grapes, these different things. The olive, so you've got figs, fruits, olives. Olives was more than just, something you could eat. It was also used for oils. It was used for all kinds of different things. And so, that is a lot right there, just in those three crops. But then he goes on, he said, the fields yield no food. Because remember when the Babylonians and the Syrians, whenever they came through, they would destroy everything. Set the fields on fire, burn, cut trees down, anything where it would benefit the group they were taking over, they would do the opposite. So cutting down the vines so that they wouldn't have any food, basically lead them to starve to death. So he's basically take away all this, and then he goes and he said, no, there's no food in the fields, and the flock will be cut off. There will be no herd in the stall. So now you have no animals. Animals, in that culture, they didn't eat meat like we do. They only ate meat more or less on special occasions. They more or less ate bread and vegetables most of the time. And so here talking about not only are they going to lose their everyday essentials, but now they're going to lose the special things. But not only that, but also what they used to work with it, because the animals were used to work the fields. So in all those things, he said, yet all those things are going to be gone. Everything that is going to be taken from us, he says, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will take joy in the God of my salvation. What a message that needs to be heard today.
That like Job.
Also, the song by Crowder, Good God Almighty.
Yeah.
That's what I thought about when I was reading that.
So everything that is, thinking about all that could be taken away, would we still be able to say, I will rejoice in the Lord. I will praise Him, for He is the God of my salvation. Will we do that? Can we do that? You know, I mean, that sounds like some New Testament stuff.
Yeah.
Verse 19, he finishes with, God the Lord is my strength. He makes my feet like the deer's. He makes me tread on my high places. God is the one who allows him, he recognizes that God is the one who allows him to be able to endure in tough times. Powerful message in chapter 3 of this little book. Just those last 3 verses are powerful. I hope you'll take the time to appreciate these little books and these little nuggets of gold that we find in them. These powerful messages that God has given us to inspire in us hope. When we see things that are crumbling around us, there's always hope, because He has placed hope in our hands by giving us His Son, Jesus. Whether we live to see it or not, it doesn't matter. When we have faith and trust in Him, He's already promised our future. He's already secured that, and He just tells us, just have trust and to be faithful. And I like that message. Well, that's all I have for today. Do y'all have any comments? Anything that you'd like to add or talk about there? All right. Well, if not, then Barbara, would you close us out in prayer today?